So the other day I did a video talking about what the Elden Ring experience was like on the Steam Deck versus the console, and ultimately one of the biggest advantages that I pointed out for playing on the Steam Deck was the fact that the Steam Deck did have two sets of rear paddles, which made it really easy to remap the face buttons to the rear. That way you could keep your thumbs on the sticks to maintain things like camera control during particularly hairy boss battles. And I think that's a really cool feature, specifically for games that are really action heavy that also have complex control schemes. Because the last thing that you want to do is get stuck in the middle of a vicious boss battle or something like that, and then lose control of the camera because you had to move your thumb to hit a face button. This often led me to utilize what is known as the claw grip, where you hold the controller in a very unnatural way and sort of hook your right index finger up to the face buttons, so you can use your index finger to hit face buttons while you keep your thumbs on the sticks to make sure that you maintain camera control. However, while the claw grip can technically work, on a long enough timeline, which for me was about 100 hours of play in Elden Ring, it gets super uncomfortable. So I finally took the plunge and bought my first ever SCUF controller, which actually does have two sets of rear paddles. As you can see, it's the PS5 SCUF Reflex right here. Now, I've never had a SCUF controller before, so what I wanted to do today was actually do a full review of this controller based on the past 2 or 3 months or so that I've been playing it, rather than just using the regular DualSense that I've got back there, and really just go over my thoughts on what you can expect if you decide to grab one of these yourself, and whether or not I think it's worth it. However, while I've never had a SCUF controller before, I have used controllers that have rear paddles before. The first being one of those Xbox Elite controllers that I got open box at Best Buy for a pretty good deal a couple years back, and then the other would have been the PS4 DualShock back button attachment, which was surprisingly good for a $29.99 add-on, and I really enjoyed using it. And while the SCUF controller that I have here was great for Elden Ring, hilariously, the back button attachment that I used to use on the PS4 was great for playing Bloodborne, which I was really into at the time. But enough background, let's just go ahead and dive right into what you can expect from a SCUF controller if you're in the market for a controller that has rear paddles and you really want to make sure you have a lot more control over your PS5 games. And for starters, I gotta give them props, I really like the packaging that the SCUF Reflex arrives in. It's a really bold package that feels like it contains a premium device. Opening the box up, you'll find the controller itself, a braided USB-C cable, and a couple of replacement analog sticks if you don't like the concave option, you would prefer convex. Nowadays, if you order one of these controllers, you have a lot more customization options, but when I first ordered mine a few months back, really the only option for this was the steel gray, which I really like, to be honest. It's a good looking color with black accents, and these hyper orange rings around the analog sticks, which almost makes it look like it's a branded controller for The Division. And you'll also notice that none of the face buttons are labeled on this controller, which honestly, if you're in a position where you're seeking out a premium controller for your gaming needs, you probably already know what each one of these is, so it's really not a big deal that it doesn't actually have the circle, square, triangle, and X on it. Although it might be confusing if you hand it to someone else. Something else I really like about the look of this controller is their choice to put this sort of honeycomb, like very subtle black camo grid pattern on select portions of the controller. You can find it on the bottom portion of R2 and L2, and you can also find it hiding underneath the sticks themselves whenever you move them. It's subtle, but definitely attractive. But aesthetically speaking, I absolutely love the way this controller looks. But aside from the bold design choices of the aesthetics, let's go ahead and look at what functionally makes the SCUF Reflex different from your standard DualSense. For starters, on the front of the controller, rather than having the standard PlayStation logo for your home button, it actually has a recessed, more traditional home button. And I'm kind of split on how I feel about it. On the one hand, with it not being raised, it has a clear tactile distinction from the mute button that's right underneath of it, so I think it's more difficult to mispress. But on the other, I've spent so much time playing with a regular DualSense at this point that it does feel kind of confusing when I reach there expecting to feel that grip of the PlayStation logo and instead have a smooth circular button. It's not a big deal, but it is noticeable. Moving around to the rear of the controller, you'll find some rubberized grips, which really does give it a more secure feel than the standard DualSense. But the biggest draw here are the 4 removable and remappable rear paddles. These paddles also have that honeycomb sort of camouflage grid, and it does have a kind of gritty texture to it, which I really like. And smack in the middle of the rear, you'll find the button that's used not only for switching between the 3 different profiles you can define for this controller, but you can also hold this button to make sure that you can map each button that you would like to its respective rear paddle. The only other major differences that I can see between this and a standard DualSense is the fact that the touchpad does have more of a matte finish to it, so it feels a little bit softer underneath your thumb whenever you're trying to use the touchpad for anything. And also, on account of the rear paddles, there is a little bit more weight to this device, which doesn't make it heavy, it's not uncomfortable to use, but it is noticeable. Alright, so we've talked about the aesthetics and the functional differences between this and your standard DualSense, but how does it actually perform? Well, I can tell you after spending a couple hundred hours with this controller so far that I have not at all registered a single mispull when it comes to those rear paddles. This was something that I kind of struggled with the Xbox Elite controller. I really liked the rear paddles on that controller, but at the same time, they had kind of like a hair trigger about them where it was really easy to activate them accidentally. However, with this one, I have not done so at all on accident. Now, something else that I really like about the paddles here is that you don't technically pull all 4 of them. The bottom 2 can be pulled with your middle fingers easily enough, but then it's almost like you push up a little bit with your middle knuckle to activate the other 2. At first that might feel weird to you, but in a way I think it's more efficient because I don't have to put 2 fingers back there to make sure that I can pull 2 sets of paddles. Rather, I can do both of them with a single finger resting on the back, which for me personally is a little bit more comfortable. And even though you can technically remove these, I haven't had occasion to do so, and they definitely feel secure in there and not at all like they're just going to drop out or anything like that. Also, I should point out that the rear paddles feel distinctly clicky and not mushy at all, meaning that if you pull one of these, you're going to know that it's been pulled and not question whether or not you actually activated the button. But aside from the rear paddles and the added weight, pretty much everything else about this controller feels just like a DualSense 5, which I think is a really smart design choice on SCUF's part because, on the one hand, it's not so far removed from a DualSense 5 that's going to feel weird and alien whenever you hold it, but it is distinctive enough that it does feel like you're using a premium product. Well, for the most part, because I do have a couple of gripes about this controller. One is, and I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, I'm going to try to hold it close to the mic I've got up here, but it was a little bit creaky, and I think it still might be. Listen to this. Like, between the shell here, whenever I, like, squeeze the controller, like, it's not a deal breaker or anything, but for a controller that costs over $200, I would not expect anything about this to be creaky. Now, to be fair, I think it's gotten a little bit better over time, but it was a little disconcerting after throwing down over $200 for this controller, knowing that it might not be as resilient as the standard DualSense. For charging that kind of a premium price, I would not expect anything like that. To be fair, I've had no functional problems with it, I'm just saying it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. The only other minor complaint that I have about the SCUF Reflex is the fact that you can't drop it into the official charging dock. Because of the rear paddles, it just doesn't fit. Now, to be fair, I do appreciate a clean minimalist setup, but it's not going to break my heart if I have to charge this thing through a cable or anything. So after hundreds of hours with this thing, what is my final verdict? I would say that it is justifiable, but not necessarily worth it. I realize that sounds a little bit like a paradox, but hear me out. On the one hand, if you're really in the market for a controller and you want that added control and flexibility, and you want to make sure that, again, you can keep your thumbs on the sticks and not have to contort your hand into like this horrible claw grip in order to play certain games more effectively, it's definitely a justifiable purchase, especially if you spend hundreds or thousands of hours gaming in any given year, like I do. But at the same time, do I think everything that's in this controller warrants a $220 price tag? I don't. Even though I like the design, even though I think that, you know, it feels like a premium device for the most part, aside from the creakiness that I mentioned, it just doesn't feel like it's adding as much to the equation that it really warrants that sort of price. Granted, I went for it, but I don't know if I would buy it again. And I would say for me, the biggest takeaway having purchased this device for myself is that, yes, it is my standard go-to, it feels great, it does exactly what I need it to do, but it also makes me want to seek out some other alternatives. For example, there are kits you can buy on Amazon that will allow you to add a suspiciously similar looking set of rear paddles to a standard DualSense 5. Maybe at some point in the future I'll give that a shot because I think that would be a cheaper way to get what you're after than spending $220 for the privilege. But then again, I'm also speaking from the position of somebody who's not a pro gamer. Like, I play a lot of games, but I'm not like playing in a competitive scene or any sort of like, you know, esports arena or something like that. And for people like that, this controller may be just like a no-brainer, you absolutely need it. I'm saying for the average casual consumer or somebody who plays games a lot, but maybe they're not playing like at the professional level, I don't know that you need to spend $220 on this. I don't regret it, it's doing what I need to, but at the same time, I don't quite think it's worth the asking price that they're putting out there. But hey, what do you think? Have you ever used a SCUF controller before? If so, what has your experience been like? You know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Let me know in the comments below, especially if you have some alternatives that you would recommend, because there has to be another option somewhere out there that has rear paddles. But anyways, thanks so much for taking the time to watch the video. I always appreciate it. Have an amazing day, and I'll see you on the next one.